informative. It sounds like it's right up to date, so I don't know what Medea is going to add to that, but that's going to be cool. So my name is Bill Meyer. I'm the chair of the Michigan chapter of the U.S. Peace Council. I want to thank you all for being here. The U.S. Peace Council is a multiracial, pro-working class, anti-imperialist organization committed to peace, economic and social justice, and to international solidarity with the peoples of the world. The U.S. Peace Council was founded in 1979 in major cities. It's affiliated with the World Peace Council, which was founded in 1949, which is the world's largest peace organization, and an NGO member of the United Nations. We stand for peace and justice. There cannot be peace without justice. Elimination of all forms of colonialism, neocolonialism, racism, and sexism. Struggles for national independence and sovereignty, and for universal disarmament, just to outline a few of our positions. We're very honored to be asked to sponsor this event, along with a great group in Ann Arbor called the Ann Arbor Coalition Against War. And Linda Wan has been working with us, and we're very excited about this two-night event with Medea Bejamin. Thank you, Linda. You'll be here in a minute. So there's 3 events going on. This event, and then after this there'll be a rally and a march. And then tomorrow there's a second speaking engagement with Medea. Just to announce the program and the timing so you know what's going on. We're going to introduce Medea in a minute. She's going to speak for around 30 minutes. And then there'll be a Q&A. And you're all invited to speak. Ask questions. 1 minute limit. And then after that, we're going to have a march out the door here around 5:45, 5:30. Go down Livernois and back up here, maybe a half an hour total. I hope you brought signs, and you're welcome to join us if you can. Come back into this room, and we're going to have a rally sponsored by several groups that are working together to endorse UNAC, a United National Anti-War Coalition, their call for actions across the country for a week of action. So we organized with several groups, the CPUSA, the Moratorium Now, CWL, several groups are going to be part of that, and you're all invited to be there. After that, we'll come back in with the rally, and you'll also have a chance again to speak and voice your opinions and concerns. UNAC's slogans, by the way, are Stop U.S. NATO Wars and Sanctions, From Cuba and Palestine to Russia and China. We need billions for housing, health care, jobs, and climate, not for war profiteering. That's their position. So that's what we'll be doing when we come back. So even within the left, we know that there's differences, divisions. U.S. on the role of the U.S. NATO role and the whole thing in Ukraine. Some people think the U.S. has nothing to do with it. I don't know where those people have been living, but they're somewhere. And other people think it's all because of the U.S. and NATO. So there's different degrees. There's people who call it a proxy war with the U.S. and Russia. There's people who know about the U.S. empire and are fighting the empire as one of the deadliest constructions in world history. And so people have differences about how to use sanctions, which is actually an act of war. It kills people. Sanctions kill people. We have differences about funding war. I mean, we say we're against war, but yet we want to send billions to around the world to support our side or whatever. That's our government I'm talking about, not us in this room here. Okay, so our Q&As will be respectful, and you're allowed to speak your differences because we want your opinions. And we want to try to find a way to work together, hoping to find common ground in the long but necessary struggle to find peace and justice in the world. So I'm going to introduce Medea Bejamin, who you obviously know a lot about her already. I mean, how can you not know Medea Bejamin? I mean, she's been everywhere. Okay. So there's a little short bio. I sort of summarized it here. So just in case you missed a few points, I learned something new. First of all, she's a co-founder of the women's-led or a peace group, CODEPINK, which we all love and support. She's also the human rights group. She started Global Exchange, the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, Unfreeze Afghanistan, which advocates for returning the $7 billion of Afghan funds frozen in the U.S. banks. Medea has been an advocate for social justice for 50 years, described as one of America's most committed and most effective fighters for human rights by New York Newsday. She's received numerous prizes, including the Martin Luther King Jr. Peace Prize, the U.S. Peace Memorial Prize, the Gandhi Peace Award, and the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation Award. She's a former economist and nutritionist. Really? Can fit all that in there? Okay. With the United Nations and World Health Organization. In 2000, she was a Green Party member, a candidate for California Senate. She led delegations to, Pakistan, Yemen, to meet with the drone strike victims, to Israel, Palestine, Gaza. She was initiated the Gaza Freedom March in 2010, participated in the Freedom Flotillas. She was in Egypt during the terrorist uprising, in North Korea, and in Iran in favor of the Iran nuclear deal and normalizing relations. What did she miss? Was there something she missed? No. Author of 10 books, like she writes books in between these trips. And, her articles appear regularly in outlets like The Hill, Salon, Common Dreams, and The Progressive. We are very honored to have her here today. And without further ado, please welcome our guest of honor, Medea Bejamin.
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you to the Michigan Peace Council and the Ann Arbor Coalition Against War and this fantastic place, this General Baker Center, which is such an amazing gathering spot. And it's great to see some old friends here. I think one thing that Bill didn't say was the Cuba work. And here we have some wonderful people who have done such great work on Cuba, my friends Felix and Cheryl and others of you, Ken, who work with the caravans. So it's great to be in Detroit. As Bill said, we have a lot of differences on this issue. Even those of us here, I'm sure, have differences on this issue. I just started this speaking tour, and it's really funny because, like, people told me when I go to Chicago, there's going to be Iranian Americans who want more weapons protesting my talk. And when I've been speaking in Boston at some of the universities, young people really are getting down and saying, you are blaming the U.S. way too much for this. And maybe in this room you'll say I'm blaming Russia too much for this. So who knows? But we've got to overcome our differences, as Bill said, and we got to get together and do something about this. Because where are we going? Even Joe Biden himself finally said that this might lead to a nuclear Armageddon. Now, he didn't say it when he was doing some kind of press conference or a policy talk about what the U.S. was going to be doing about this. He said it, do you know where he said it?
Investors.
At a fundraiser for the media mogul James Murdoch house. He said it at a fundraiser. So it wasn't part of anything to say, well, we might actually have a nuclear Armageddon, but give us some more money so we can send that money to Ukraine. It is seriously, at this time of the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a time to really reflect on where the heck we are and where the heck we might be going. And there are a couple of op-eds that are coming out now looking at the missile crisis and what happened. And there's two things I wanted to mention about the missile crisis, because one is that there were actually talks between JFK and Khrushchev. They both recognized, we better talk to each other. There was also compromise. Now, what the American people remember, if they remember anything, is that Russia removed its missiles. Most Americans don't know that the U.S. removed missiles from Turkey. And that's what happens when you talk, right? There's compromises. And there's something that JFK said in a speech he gave a year later that resonates so much with the crisis today. He said, make sure to avoid, in a confrontation with a nuclear power, putting them in the position where they have to choose between a humiliating defeat and nuclear war.
Right.
And that's exactly what the US is trying to do now. Put Putin in a position of humiliating defeat. And it gives me chills just to think about it. So what is the alternative? A nuclear war. When I spoke in a couple of classes to young people last week, I talk about nuclear war and I see these blank stares. When I talk to some of you, I see the, yeah, we are concerned about that. I mean, you should be concerned about it. But young people, I see a young person. It doesn't mean all that much to you, right? Yeah.
No, it means a lot.
It means a lot. Okay. For this class I was talking to, they were just really kind of blank. And I said, does nuclear war, resonate? And they said, it sounds terrible, but we have no reference points. And some of us that are older remember the drills where we had to go under our desks at schools if there was a nuclear war. But what I find with younger people is that it's the climate crisis that really resonates. And what we have to do when we talk about this issue is talk more about how it's related to the climate crisis, because it is totally. When the war first broke out, there were a bunch of environmental groups that came together, about 200 of them, not just in the US, across Europe particularly. And they started a letter and a website called standwithukraine.com, I think. And the letter basically said, we are against the Russian invasion, we have to boycott Russian energy, and we have to use this opportunity to move quickly to green energy. Well, some of us kind of scratched our heads and said, where were they during the 7 years of the Saudi invasion of Yemen, and why didn't they call for a boycott of Saudi energy? And when you're talking about abusive countries that have a lot of energy, what about right here in the US? But what the heck? Okay, they're calling for a boycott of energy. And then we saw, as time went on, groups like Greenpeace were putting their ships out and trying to stop Russian ships in the water and things like that. But what was happening was that as the Saudi energy was being boycotted, there was a mad scramble by energy companies, particularly here in the US, to try to take advantage of that and be the ones that would then supply the energy. So there was a demand for more exploration for oil, for more fracking of dirty gas, and there was a use more of coal. And in places around Europe, nuclear plants that were supposed to be decommissioned were then not being decommissioned. And so there is a mad scramble to replace the Russian energy by US companies. Let me just throw out a little question for you. Who do you think blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline?
US Navy.
So I'm speaking to a particular crowd here that has a particular opinion. But I saw a great cartoon the other day, and it said, who hated the Russian pipelines? The USA. Who said they wanted to stop them from being built in the first place? The USA. Who said they had the capacity to destroy them? The USA. Who would benefit from them being blown up? The USA. Who blew them up? We have no idea. So the other consequences, environmental ones, that we have to talk about are what is happening to the funds that were supposed to be dedicated to the Global Climate Fund to help poor countries deal with the climate crisis. And this is something that came forward in a very eloquent and heartfelt way in September when the United Nations was holding its General Assembly, and the leaders of every country get a chance to have 15 minutes to address the world community. It's their 15 minutes of fame. And my colleague and I, who wrote the book together, Nicholas Davis, we analyzed every single speech that was given during that General Assembly. And we found that 66 nations took time out of their 15 minutes to address this issue by saying basically, we are not interested in taking sides in this. We are on the side of peace. And we want you all who are involved in this to come together and figure a way out of this. And you had the president of Pakistan, not a very progressive guy at all, but a place where a third of the country is now underwater, not because of anything that they did, because of what the rich countries have done. And he said, we don't have money to help millions of people, and thousands of our people have died during this flood. And yet the international community is focused, the rich community is focused on Ukraine. What about our country? And then you had the heads of these small island states whose very existence as a nation is under threat. And one of them said, you promised us this $100 billion fund back in 2010. And despite your promises of $100 billion, you've only come through with $10 billion, a tenth of that. And yet when this Ukraine war started, you have already given $100 billion. And the year is not even out yet for this war in Ukraine. Where are the priorities? So we have to talk to young people about how are we going to have an agreement at the next COP27 meeting that's happening in Egypt next month if the Russians and the US don't talk to each other, and if the Chinese are barely talking to the US anymore. What kind of global agreements can be reached? There's also the issue of increased hunger. I work a lot in Afghanistan because I'm just furious that after 20 years of destroying their country, we get out and then we keep $7 billion in their assets. But there is tremendous hunger in Afghanistan, and 1/3 of the appeal of the United Nations has not been funded. And then look at Yemen, tremendous catastrophe there, people going hungry. And now with the Ukraine war, the prices have gone up, not just of energy, but also of commodities, like food commodities, and the same diversion of funds away from places like Africa, like Yemen, like Afghanistan, into Ukraine. And so these are issues that we have to connect when we're talking about the ripple effect of this war that is affecting the entire world. One thing I hear, though, as I go out talking about this issue, is people constantly saying, but you can't negotiate with Putin. No negotiation is possible. So I want to throw out a couple of ways that we can respond to that. One is to say, there already have been negotiations. We talked in this film about the negotiations at the end of March, early April, that were actually moving towards an agreement until the US and the UK came and torpedoed those negotiations. And there have been other negotiations that have been going on. For example, negotiations to get a lot of that grain out of Ukraine into the international market, which was negotiations to create land corridors as well as sea corridors, and a lot of that grain has been getting out. Negotiations to get the International Atomic Energy Association into the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. And then very, very delicate negotiations for prisoner swaps. You know, there have been about 16 prisoner swaps already. And having one prisoner swap is a very difficult thing to do because logistically it's very difficult to carry out, and you have to have a level of trust in the middle of a war where you hate each other and you're killing each other, a level of trust that both sides are going to come through with what they said. And the fact that there have been 16 prisoner swaps, some of them with large numbers of prisoners, like hundreds of prisoners, is quite remarkable. The other thing to recognize is that we can easily say, if you think that Putin is a madman and could possibly use nuclear weapons, don't you think it's important to try to talk to him? And then the last thing people say, the US never tried to scuttle those talks. That is all coming from Russia. Well, last week Zelensky himself issued a decree saying he refused to talk to Putin. And Biden has been saying publicly that we will not talk to Putin. And for the last 8 months, he has been absolutely irresponsible in not talking to Putin. And so has our Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, been absolutely irresponsible. He is supposed to be the top diplomat of this country. What do diplomats do? They talk to each other. And he has refused to talk to his counterpart, Lavrov, in Russia. Meanwhile, there are other people in this country that are advocating negotiations. We heard the old war hawk Kissinger talk about it, but you might have also heard Donald Trump talk about it. Donald Trump has been going to his rallies and using social media to condemn Biden's handling of this crisis. He has said, were he president, the war would have never happened. And if he got involved now and he put himself forward as a mediator, he said he would end this crisis because he would talk to Putin. He would communicate. And Biden refuses to communicate. Now, some might snicker and say, oh, you know, Trump just says that kind of garbage. But you know what? He says it for a reason. He says it because it resonates with the people who he is talking to. Because people are realizing, and we're talking about working families who are having a hard time, even though the gas prices have gone down a little bit, they're going to come right back up. And people who are suffering with inflation right now know that at least part of this can be blamed on the war in Ukraine. And they're seeing their government give now, it's been over $60 billion to this war. Now, we mentioned in the film that when the $40 billion package was passed, there was not one Democrat who stood up and said peep. And then after that, more recently, there was another package of over $13 billion that was just passed in September. Not one Democrat said peep. When the $40 billion was passed, there were 57 Republicans who voted against it in the House and 11 Republicans in the Senate who voted against it. Now, some of them had what I would consider very crazy reasons for voting against it. Some of them said, why are we focusing on Russia? We should put all those weapons against China. Others of them said, we should be putting that to militarize the southern border against the hordes of immigrants who want to come into this country and ruin our country. But others said things that I think would resonate with those of us in this room. They said there are all kinds of unmet needs here in the United States. And people that we might think are the kookiest people in Congress, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, said, how come we can't put baby food on the shelves and yet we can give billions of dollars to keep a war going in Ukraine?
Amen.
Raise your hand if you heard any speaking from, and admit it if you had, from Fox News anchors. No, you don't listen. Who'd you hear?
Tucker Carlson.
Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson reaches millions and millions of people. And I think you should just go Google a little Tucker Carlson and Ukraine. It sounds like it could be written by us, the things that he's saying. And he also, there's another anchor, Will Kane in Fox News, who recently came out with his position on Ukraine, and basically what he was saying is it worth is defending Ukraine worth the risk of nuclear war? A very rational position, I would say. And how many of you, raise your hand if you've heard Tulsi Gabbard in the last week. So a number of you have, and for those who haven't, she was a congresswoman, a Democrat. She's still in the military. She was a presidential candidate who, when she pulled out, who did she endorse? Bernie Sanders, that's right. Now she came out and said she's quitting the Democratic Party because it's a party of warmongers. And when she was on Josh Rogan's show just a couple of days ago, she gave an incredible talk about Ukraine and what this was all about, and the weapons manufacturers and the military-industrial complex and how they were benefiting hand over foot from this war. Now, if you listen to the entire Tulsi Gabbard's speech that she gave while she was quitting the party, it was full of horrible things as well about other issues that I think some of us care a lot about. But on that issue of the war, she's coming out there to really be taking a lead with an anti-war position. And I think she's positioning herself to be a vice presidential candidate for Trump or somebody in the next elections. The point I'm saying in all of this is that because it's a Democrat in the White House, Democrats that should be with us on this are afraid of speaking out. And so this issue is being taken by the right, and I would say in many cases it's the extreme right. Because let's be clear, the position of mainstream war hawk Republicans is to give more and more weapons to Ukraine. So there is a discussion that could and should be had about should we be making alliances with people on the extreme right about this. And there certainly are a lot of libertarians who you would not characterize as extreme right, and some of you in this room might be libertarians who have taken a good position on this. But we also have to get people who consider themselves progressive to stand up and do something. And that's why I've been starting this tour and going around the country. That's why I think it's so important we have these discussions about what are we going to do. And that's why it's so important that we're passing around this sign-up sheet right now, because we want to stay in touch with you, to be thinking together about how we're going to rebuild a peace movement that was so strong when there's a draft in the case of Vietnam. When there wasn't a draft, it was harder, but there was still a strong peace movement at the time of the Iraq War. When Obama came in, the peace movement just died because so many people were more concerned about getting a Democrat in the White House than they were about stopping the wars the U.S. was involved in. And here we are at a time in history when, let's face it, we're doing a miserable job as people who want to see an end to militarism, because we haven't been able to stop the growing power of the military-industrial complex. We haven't been able to stop the Pentagon budget. The money to Ukraine, by the way, is in addition to the huge Pentagon budget. Now, with what is happening in Ukraine, NATO has been strengthened, and militarism around the world is being strengthened, which strengthens a lot of people on the right. So I want to move to the discussion just by saying how urgent this moment is to get over all of our differences that we have among us about how much blame we're going to put on this and how much blame we're going to put on that. And are we Marxist Leninists, or are we Trotskyists, or are we this, or are we that, or are we socialists? You know what? At some points in history, like this one, all of that has to be put to the side, and we have to come together about what we agree on. And I think what we agree on is we can't allow this to go to nuclear Armageddon. I think what we agree on is that we need those funds at home to provide health care for us, to provide free college education for us, and that we need that money for the kind of Green New Deal that we believe in, that will really address the existential threat to this planet, which is the crisis of the climate. So thank you for listening to me, and now we'll open it up for discussion.
Medea Bejamin. So we have opinions in this room, I guarantee you, because I know most of you. And we're not afraid of any of your opinions. We want to hear it because we love you all for coming here and being part of this. Let's just love each other and try to find a way to work together and say, I don't agree with you. Let's find a way to do it. We can do it.
Yeah. Russ Beland, and I want to hit 4 bullet points since for the 1 minute limit. The Azov Battalion was properly described in the media and in the presentation as a Nazi formation grown out of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, which were Nazi collaborators in World War II, mass exterminationists. And they are in Washington, D.C., and have been in Washington, D.C., lobbying members of Congress to lift the ban on funding the Azov Nazis. John Conyers originally put that in legislation and got a unanimous yes vote in 2016. The Obama administration used the Pentagon to have that undone, and it was put back in 2018. They are lobbying, but nobody's lobbying against them. And I've asked people in my emails, will you talk to me and tell me if you will help? And I'm not getting any responses but from 2 people out of 1,000 people I emailed. People are acting dead on this, and it's disturbing. Secondly, on April and November of 2021, the United States and Ukraine, the U.S. State Department and Ukraine government, signed joint declarations declaring that the United States would build the military of the Ukraine to retake territories from Russia. I have those documents. In other words, the United States was saying they were going to engage in war against Russia in 2021 in 2 statements separately, and no one talks about that. Third, the reason there was a, quote, civil war in Ukraine in 2014 is because Nazi-oriented forces took over in the coup initiated by the United States, and I believe it was President Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, said in December 2014, here's how we're going to win the war in Ukraine. We're going to cut their utilities, no electricity, no water, and we're going to make it so that nobody can live in the eastern Ukraine unless they live in their basement. And even, frankly, friends, that wasn't enough. And finally, the United States has periodically in its history threatened to use nuclear weapons and offered them to other countries to use them. The United States has, 1, never repudiated first strike. 2, has an ongoing $1 trillion upgrade program for nuclear weapons. We are actively promoting the prospect of nuclear war with our policies, and everybody is silent on that too.
Yeah, thanks for making those points for us. In terms of the Azov Battalion, you mentioned how John Connors got that into the legislation, and Ro Khanna got it back in recently. But now that we're sending all of these weapons and the Azov Battalion is part of the Ukrainian army, there's no way to monitor that. And when the U.S. Congress allocated that $40 billion, it was Senator Rand Paul, a libertarian, like his father Ron Paul, who said, wait a minute, what about the accountability? How do we know where this is going? And the rest of Congress said, oh, you know, the heck with that. So there is nothing now to stop those weapons from going to the Azov Battalion. Not only that, now it is a hub for neo-Nazis from all over the world who are going into Ukraine. And so who's going to end up with those weapons? We're going to have repercussions for this, just like when we gave weapons to the Mujahideen, just like we gave all the weapons we had in Iraq that led to ISIS, and the Mujahideen that led to Al-Qaeda. So yes, we're going to feel the backlash of this for decades to come. And I also wanted to make a point about retaking every inch of territory, which is now the position of Zelensky. Whereas earlier we heard him say in April that he was going to have to recognize neutrality for Ukraine. He was going to have to actually go back to what he campaigned on and won overwhelmingly support when he became president, which was to actually implement the Minsk II agreements and give autonomy to those breakaway states. He's not saying that anymore. He's saying recover every inch of the Donbass. And then finally, your issue about who has threatened the use of nuclear weapons. Well, of course, it's the U.S. is the only country that's ever used nuclear weapons. And I just wrote a piece with my colleague Marcy Winograd on nuclear extortion, laying out all the times that the U.S. has used the threat of nuclear weapons. So thank you very much for your points.
Thank you.
So as the danger increases, and it's increasing rapidly, more and more people are going to take notice. And we're going to have more and more opportunities to engage in conversations. And when I'm out on ground cover, I'm going to say 10% of the people I've talked to, is moving towards 20%, want to talk. And they want to talk about serious stuff. So as the danger increases, we're going to have more and more opportunities in our everyday lives to have conversations and to build the organizations that are beginning to work more and more together. I mean, I'm amazed that I'm back in Detroit now because of all the connections that are happening. So Ann Arbor's an important place. The Ann Arbor-Detroit relationship, because there's a tendency in Ann Arbor to look down on Detroit as if they can't manage their own affairs. And now's the time that Ann Arbor and Detroit can build an equal relationship to speak to all the people, the middle class, the working class. Now, it is important to have some historical perspective. I've been in Detroit a long time, Ann Arbor a short time, but if you're going to take I-75 north to 14 Mile, there's a big cemetery. The Polar Bear Brigade is there, the veterans of the Polar Bear Brigade. This goes back to World War I when the U.S. jumped into the Civil War, made a terrible civil war. NATO was formed to take down the Soviet Union. Hitler was kind of given the green light. A lot of it's investors are happy with the war machine. The war machine is the biggest threat to the environment and to our lives. The more we get clear on these simple things, there's a historical context and the danger is increasing. We can do a lot of good work now. I'm ready to go to D.C. to lobby.
Ooh,
Thanks for coming, Medea. My name is Jim Ryan. I'm with Veterans for Peace and the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project within Veterans for Peace. And first I want to make a comment, and I'll send you this paper. When you're talking to younger folks about the threat of nuclear war, there was a modeling done about a complete nuclear exchange by Russia and the United States, and all the particulate matter that would result in into the atmosphere. Just for example, the growing periods for a couple of years afterwards, after this exchange in Michigan, would be between 0 and 25 days per year, which means you wouldn't be growing anything. But so I'll send that paper to you. If anybody else wants that, I can give them I can send it to them. The comment I have is, yes, we're sending money for arms, we're spending money for arms for Ukraine, but that pales in comparison with, as you mentioned, and what Bill had on the screen, the whole Pentagon budget. In fact, we've increased, Congress in its wisdom, increased the budget by what? Some $30 billion, they're still negotiating it, that Biden didn't even ask for. So, I mean, that is the problem. We're the most militaristic country in the world, and I know you brought it up, but I think that needs to be stressed more. Like I said, this huge budget is, much larger than what we're sending to Ukraine, which they're actually fighting the war, and we're supposedly in peacetime, if we ever have been in peacetime for the last couple of centuries. But thanks again for coming.
well, thank you so much, and thank you to Veterans for Peace for the fabulous work that you do. And the environmental working group in Veterans for Peace has really been fantastic. I'd love to get the information you talked about. And I can't agree more that what Ken said earlier about November giving us an opportunity. And, you know, I mentioned how the Democrats are afraid to go against Biden during an election time, and how I think Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer have kind of pulled the reins and gotten them in line and said, you know, we have to look tough and we have to be united, and so don't say anything until after the elections. I think after the elections we are going to have a lot more of a possibility to influence those who call themselves progressives to come out and join us on these issues, but we have to be ready, and we do have to lobby them. And you know, I know that people in this room, I guess, let me just have a wild guess, you don't have a lot of faith in the two-party system, huh? Well, you know, it's what we have. And while we are trying to change it to something else, we have this crisis here. And so it is important to try to push our members of Congress. It is important to go to their offices here and meet with them, even if it's hitting your head against a brick wall. And it is important to try to make your way in Washington. And CODEPINK has helped many groups, and we're happy to help you in Washington find places for you to stay if you come, help you get meetings in Congress. It is important. It's frustrating, incredibly frustrating. If there's time, I'll tell you some stories about last week in Congress and what it was like to go in and talk to them, including in Bernie Sanders' office. But we have to do it. So thank you.
My name is Jerry Goldberg. I'm a longtime activist in Detroit. I want to make a brief comment, but I want to ask you a question that kind of follows up to what you were just saying. One is, a few months ago, I had the opportunity, I was invited to speak at a rally in Benton Harbor, which is a city where the black community is being poisoned by lead in the water. And what I was struck by at the rally was that several of the speakers raised opposition to the U.S. funding for the war in the Ukraine. One of them was the head of the African People's Socialist Party that, of course, has been raided for their opposition, but also Reverend Pinckney himself, and a leader from Flint. And it was well received, and it showed how easy it is to raise the issue among poor people who are directly affected by the fact that the funding that they need for human needs are directed to war, and how the left, the collapse really of the left in dealing with this issue is opening the door to the right to be the spokesperson, when really we have a base that's ready to hear us. My other question to you, and you spoke to this a little, but I know I was boggled. I expect 99% of the Democrats to go with war, because the Democrats have been the party of war and imperialism just as Republican for years. But when you see Barbara Lee go with Pelosi, and we see the silence of Rashida to Ukraine, and the silence really of the squad on this issue, how do you account for this complete collapse of this tiny wing, the tiny progressive wing of this party that has been completely silent in this issue, which really is a cutting-edge issue of imperialist war? It's just mind-boggling. And as someone who deals with this sector much more than me, how do you account for this, really, when it's been a complete collapse?
Well, thank you, and how true your words are. I don't know if any of you heard me on Democracy Now! Recently, but I got myself in trouble by announcing an initiative that the Progressive Caucus is trying to do on this, and it's secret, so I shouldn't have said anything, so I can't say anything. But they're trying to get some momentum among progressives on this issue. It doesn't really challenge the weapons. It is more calling for diplomacy. And how do you account for someone like Barbara Lee? Well, you know, it's interesting. I was talking to somebody the other day about this, and I said, I spent many years in the Bay Area, and when Barbara Lee cast her vote against the U.S. invasions after the 9/11 attacks in 2001, she was seen as a hero in her home district, and then all over the country and all over the world when I travel, there was a slogan, Barbara Lee speaks for me, and you heard it all over. And this person said to me, Barbara Lee really suffered because of her vote. And I said, suffered? She has no problem being reelected. She's reelected like 85% of the votes. She's a hero all over the country and the world. And they said, no, you don't understand. It's within her own Democratic Party. she was castigated, she was taken out of the leadership of the Black Caucus, and she never got given a chairmanship until years have passed now. And now she got one, and she's in a powerful position. And, you know, power corrupts. So there she is. And the same thing with somebody like Jim McGovern, who's a wonderful person, a really great person, and has great positions on a lot of this. But he's now the head of the Rules Committee. And so, you know, I think, that's why I think come November, we will see a change. But when those 57 Republicans voted against the $40 billion and were asked, some of them said, we voted against it because we had pressure from our base. We're not even going to get the squad unless there's pressure from the base. And you might have seen a video that went viral the other day about two people confronting AOC at a town hall meeting.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's the kind of pressure that we need to put on them so that they're shamed for their votes. Because this is not the last of the votes. 60 billion is not enough. They're going to keep going back for more and more and more. But if we're not there to put the pressure on them, to shame them, and my group, CODEPINK, is very strong in the Bay Area, and they've been going out with other organizations like Veterans for Peace, like the local DSA folks, PSL. They've been going out and camping out in front of Nancy Pelosi's house. They've been going out in front of her office. They've been really giving her a hard time, Dianne Feinstein a hard time. I mean, that's the kind of pressure that eventually, I think, will open this issue up among the Democrats.
Hi, my name is Sonia Haynes. I just wanted to follow up on that last question. I was interested in finding out with whom you've met, like what specifically happened when you met with Barbara Lee or Bernie. You seem to indicate you met with Bernie too. And in general, is it easy to see your congresspersons now because of the January 6th thing? If you can go into that, it'd be great to hear.
Yeah, sure. Some of you who have seen CODEPINK in action over the years might have seen us in places like public hearings, or we would go in and take over offices of congresspeople. We would just go in and, you know, paste things all over the room and do a die-in and all kinds of stuff. Now, since January 6th and COVID, you can't get into public hearings, no public allowed in the public hearings, and you can't even get into the buildings without having an appointment, and then coming down outside. You have to stand outside the building, and they come in and get you and escort you up into the office. Whereas before, anybody could walk in there, and anybody could walk into any office. The doors were open. So it's a totally different scene now. It's like a morgue when you go inside there, except for the lobbyists, you know, the big time lobbyists, the military-industrial people, you know, they're in there. But you can get meetings with your members of Congress, and they will, if you bug them enough, you will get those meetings. So let me give you an example. A guy came to town from Maine, and he had never lobbied before. And he called me up and he said, I'm in town, I'm staying at the Catholic Worker House. Will you join me in some meetings I've set up? So I said, sure. We went to the first meeting, and it was his representative, a guy named Golden. You never get to see them unless you are a major donor or a lobbyist for Raytheon or Northrop Grumman. You see their staff. So we met with his legislative staff. First of all, the guy who comes down to bring us up, you can tell he's a beefy-looking guy with a shaved head. And we said, you know, what branch of the military are you in? And he was in the Navy, and there is something called a defense fellow, meaning you are positioned inside the offices of our congresspeople for a year on our tax dollar to sit in the offices to learn how Congress works, meaning to learn how you get defense contracts for your friends when you go out and join the industry. And so it's just, you know, starting from him bringing us in and telling us he was a fellow, I was like, ah. Then we meet with the legislative director, and he too is a shaved guy, kind of burly, and we said, what branch of the military are you in? And he said, oh, I was in the Marines. And Golden, turns out, was also in the military and had these, plaques up there about his tours of duty in Afghanistan and Iraq. There are so many military people in our Congress, it's unbelievable. And so there is this poor guy who came from a small town in Maine, and he says, I'm a retired social worker. I have very little money. I saved up $700 in order to make this trip because this issue is so important to me. And I came 700 miles to speak to you. And I want you to know that you're supposed to represent my district. And while you're giving billions of dollars to Ukraine, my neighbors don't have enough money to pay their heating bills this winter. My neighbors are wondering how they're going to feed their children. And I don't think you are representing your constituents by sending all this money to Ukraine. And I was just looking at the guy and saying, he's so heartfelt, he's so genuine, he's so right. And the answer from these guys is, look, I'm not going to pull the wool over your eyes. I'm going to talk straight to you. My congressperson is not going to call for negotiations. Your representative wants more weapons to be sent to Ukraine. I'm sorry to have to disappoint you, but that's his position. And that is the position you will hear not only, and this was a Democratic office, you'll hear that from most of the Republicans, and I mentioned Bernie Sanders' office. So we had a meeting in Bernie Sanders' office with one of his legislative directors, and there is this letter I'm not supposed to talk about going around for more progressives in Congress, but there's no version of it on the Senate side. And this letter, as I said, doesn't talk about weapons, it talks about negotiations. And Bernie Sanders' office. So we went and we said, we think there needs to be a similar kind of letter on the Senate side, and who but Bernie Sanders to initiate this? And the guy looks at me and he says, Medea, we think that letter is tone deaf. And I said, oh, well, we do kind of too, because it doesn't call for no more weapons, so yeah, we must be on the same page. He says, no, that's not our problem with the letter. Our problem with the letter is it calls for negotiations, and there's nobody in Russia to negotiate with. You can't negotiate with Putin. This is coming from Bernie Sanders' office.
Good for you.
I just want you to know this. This is where we are right now. So
They want more.
we've got a lot more work to do.
My name is Steve Walker. I'm the token progressive Democrat in the room. My question, there was a reference made to all these innocent Ukrainians are being slaughtered every day by Russian missiles. What's your position on creating a no-fly zone in the Ukraine?
Well, that issue, came up early on in the war, and to Biden's credit, he understood that that would mean World War III, that would mean direct confrontation with Russia. And so he took that off the table, despite the fact that there was a lot of pressure from the Ukrainian American community and from members of Congress to make that happen. So it's not been on the table, but we are coming so close to confronting the Russians directly by all the US trainers who are inside, the CIA that is inside Afghanistan, the call by Zelensky for more and more lethal weapons that are able to go and hit inside of Russia, and the intelligence that the US is giving to the Ukrainians during this whole conflict. So I'm very glad that the no-fly zone did not happen, but I think there are these other issues that are putting us closer and closer into a direct war. And we talked a lot in the video, and you all know about the provocations about NATO. But one thing you might not know is starting tomorrow, Monday, are nuclear war exercises that NATO is initiating. In the midst of all of this, war games on how to annihilate Russia with nuclear weapons. So the provocations are just astounding.
What's the name of that operation?
It's the standard nuclear war games that they do every year. In fact, Stoltenberg from the head of NATO said, well, some people have told us to call it off this year because of the conflict, but that would be sending the wrong message to Russia.
Yeah, NATO is great. My name is Renee. My question has to do with this military-industrial congressional complex. And I've been listening lately, maybe other people have heard it. That was the initial language that Eisenhower had. And some people objected to congressional, so they took that out. But since then, people have explained, I mean, I've been learning this, that and you left that out when you were talking. I think you left out the ending of that. The money, the arms do go to Zelensky or to anybody else that gets. But then they buy that from U.S. manufacturers, right? And those U.S. manufacturers, the people that do the work on this stuff, they roll around us. These are jobs for good Americans. And so these Congress people, including our own, will say, well, wait a minute, about this congressional, this peace business, getting rid of these war manufacturers. We have people that work in those industries. So how do you deal with that relationship between actually us benefiting, or working people benefiting in these armaments plants? The relationship between job and armaments.
Absolutely, and there's one little piece of that you didn't mention, which is that then those lobbyists for the weapons companies are giving donations to just about every single member of Congress. And that's not considered corruption for some reason. It's just the good old way the system works. How do you confront that? Well, there is a group called U.S. Labor Against the War. They've been trying for many years to get unions involved in this. And there are some more progressive unions that have come out at certain times against this military-industrial congressional security university think tank, what Ray McGovern calls the Mickey Matt complex, and it's got a whole, and it's an acronym for all the different ways that people benefit. The other piece of that as well, as you said, is the jobs, and the industry is so brilliant in the way that they have created. They have put their manufacturing plants in just about every single congressional district. So if you go to places that are known for being the hub of progressives, like Woodstock, New York, the home of Woodstock, the biggest employer there is a company making pieces for the military. So how do you deal with it? I once had a meeting with somebody from the Machinists Union, and he said, we were talking about conversion, because there's been a lot of efforts over the years to figure out, well, how do we move these facilities, these factories, from making things that will blow us up to making things that will save the world. And what they say is that nobody can compete with the money that the Pentagon has. That, as much money that's been given so far to solar and wind, it just does not compare with the money that's been given to the Pentagon. And so whoever made the comment earlier, the Veterans for Peace, you did, yes, that we've got to look at the budget of the Pentagon. That's where we have to make the cuts. And there is a Pentagon a budget reduction caucus in Congress, headed by Mark Pocan from Wisconsin, and headed by Barbara Lee. But I'll be darned if you can see the list of who is in that caucus. I'll be darned if you can tell what they are doing in that caucus, except to symbolically, every year when the National Defense Authorization Act comes out, they'll say, oh, we should cut the Pentagon by $100 billion or $200 billion, and then they do nothing that we know to actually get a lot of people, pressure their colleagues to sign on to that. So it seems like it's a sop to us rather than a real effort to cut the Pentagon. But that budget, but that is where we have to go. That's the answer. And there is a very good grouping, a coalition of groups, including the National Priorities Project you might have heard on. They do a fabulous job of what are the trade-offs, what we could be using that money for. There's Brown University called the Costs of War that does a fabulous job on that. So there are a number of groups that are working on that, but we all need to join and work harder.
Thank you for your talk. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get here sooner, but I'm just curious how you can basically be laughed at and have them just drop any pretense of democracy or any meaningful public engagement and still have optimism about our sham liberal democracy. Like, why do you still see lobbying as the most effective vehicle for change and for anti-militarism? Because I wish I could share your optimism, and I don't.
I never said it was the most effective. I said it was one of the things, it's one of the tools in our toolbox. I think most important right now is education, really, because we don't have the people power to do the kind of mass mobilizing that would have an impact. You know, what do I think makes change? It means getting 5% of the population at the most is what you need, right, to make change happen. We don't have that. So we have to do the educating, we have to do the mobilizing, and we have to do the lobbying because it's so immediate and because they're giving away so much of our money that we need for other things. I don't believe in the traditional lobbying, going in and asking your member of Congress. I believe in the more, what I call extreme lobbying. So go in and take over their office. You know, go into a die-in, go into a city. The problem is with COVID, you can't get in their offices to do that, you know. Even their local offices, it's hard to get in. But we can be outside their offices. We have to find more creative ways. They're home now. They're campaigning, going to their town halls, like the confrontation with AOC. That was a simple thing at a town hall. So that kind of thing I think is more effective than going into their office and, you know, saying, please, please, please.
Yeah, that's about writing letters to them.
You know, we have to do it all. We have something called CODEPINK Congress that we do every 2 weeks, and you're welcome to join us because every 2 weeks we focus on a very important issue. Tomorrow is going to be about China and what the U.S. is doing to antagonize China, the legislation that's been passed that's horrific about China, the new U.S. Security review that just came out that focuses on targeting China, that you know well and can tell us about, Linda. That's going to be tomorrow night. And then at the end of that call, we take an action and we do it together. And we write or we call or something. But that's just one tiny thing that we do. So it's not the most effective. It's something we can do. And if you want to join that CODEPINK Congress, you can go to codepink.org and you can find how to link up to CODEPINK Congress. Join us on the webinars every 2 weeks.
Thank you, Medea, for your work. I had a question about how to talk to ordinary people, friends, you know, about politics. I'm relatively new to like thinking and acting on politics, and so I find that when I try to have conversations with my with the friends outside of, you know, Ann Arbor Coalition Against the War in Ann Arbor, it's very awkward. And when I, you know, mention Ukraine and China, you know, people just kind of give me this weird look. Anyway, so I'm really grateful that you're coming to our town to speak tomorrow because it'll be my first opportunity to bring my non-political friends, you know, into the room and to talk about things. I've sent them invitations, like I made photocopies of those beautiful flyers that Bill designed, and snail mailed them to them. And I'm going to follow up this evening either with a phone call or an email to encourage them to come. Like, how should I phrase that nudge, and how to continue the conversation with these people, because we've got to build our numbers and you know, wake up our friends, but we got to do it in a way that's effective and that meets them where they are. Do you have any advice on that?
Well, I think mentioning that they will have an opportunity to eat your delicious baked goods would probably be a good nudge. I think the hard thing is, as you say, is getting them there.
Yeah.
And then, you know, but really getting them there from a personal, you know, we use so much social media now, we forget to call people on the phone. And I find that it's the most effective thing today is to call our friends on the phone and say, I really want you to come. You know, I really want to see you. And then getting them there, you know, maybe it's more effective. I mean, I knew this would be a very progressive crowd. It might be good to ask people, what are you most concerned about? And hear them and then tie that into this, because there are so many ways to tie this issue into what everybody cares about. You know, you take the issue of racism. Well, in this book, we give horrific stories of what happened in Ukraine when the black students in Ukraine tried to seek asylum, or when at the Mexico border, there was a separate line that was created for the white Ukrainians to come into this country. I mean, there's lots of ways to link these issues together, but the most important thing, as you said, is to get them into the room.
Okay, okay, right. Very good. Yes. I don't know, sometimes it's strange though, when I start talking to them, they kind of look at me like, oh, you can't talk to Putin, he's evil. I mean, seriously, they're like hypnotized, and then when they look at me, I feel as if they're thinking like I'm the crazy person, but I guess I just gotta be calm and brave and focused and just keep.
Well, one other thing I found, part of my family is from Ukraine. My grandmother was a Jewish, Russian-speaking Ukrainian. My other half was from the Russia side. And one of the first talks I gave, somebody came up to me afterwards and said, I think one of the problems in your talk is you don't sound like you care about the people of Ukraine. And I think that was an important comment. No, really, I do. It really, I felt it. And even though we start out the video saying, you know, it's the Ukrainian people who are suffering, I think we have to emphasize that a lot. Because otherwise we come across as ideological. It's all about our, you know, view of the world, where it's not about real people. And so I think wherever we can emphasize that we want to stop this war because we don't want to see the Ukrainian people keep getting killed. And we don't want to see Ukrainian soldiers or Russian soldiers keep getting killed. And we're against war wherever it is. And I think that maybe just humanizes it a little more for other people.
That's perfect. Thank you. Yes. Great. Because I am really angry at our country right now, and sometimes that overrides all of my thoughts and everything. But yeah, I got to bring it back to a more human level. And
Yes.
then they'll be able to hear me.
Especially people who aren't angry at this country, because then we just lose them.
Exactly. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Catherine Montgomery. I'm a long-time peace activist in Detroit here. And I wanted to respond to the gentleman that made the comment about the jobs that are being created by the people who are making the weapons for the war. And I'm going to go back to what I learned in economics class back in college many, many years ago. War, making of weapons is inflationary. And it would be better that labor was used to create consumer goods and food and medicine and, you know, things that we can actually use in our everyday life. Not weapons that are going to be sent to another country to kill other human beings and so forth. So I have a friend who I've had an ongoing debate with him because he's a Trump supporter. And he said, you know, I'm so glad I came to this because he says that Biden has caused all this inflation. And in fact, he has, by supporting this war in the Ukraine and making no effort to try to use diplomacy to end this war. So we got a lot of work to do in the peace community. We've got a lot of work to do.
Well, thank you so much for your commitment to the issues, and thank you for your comment about the jobs, which I think is a very important angle to talk about when we talk about this, and for the recognition that this, for us, has nothing to do with partisan politics.
Hi there, Medea. Felix Shark, Yale. Born and raised, well, raised in Detroit, born in Cuba. I want to thank you for what you do for the Cuban people and what you do in general. There's an article in the New York Times this morning that speaks to the rise of veterans running for office, and they're coming from the right. And I hear you saying that, and by the way, those veterans are anti-war, but they're coming from the right, they're anti-war. And I hear you saying that the anti-war call is coming from the right. You mentioned Marjorie Taylor Greene. While we are all, for the most part, left-leaning here, help me understand, or help us understand, what is happening and where does that leave everything?
So thank you for the work you're doing to try to stop what was Trump's horrific policy. Well, it's been horrific policy towards Cuba since the time of the revolution, but Trump made it so much worse, and Biden has done virtually zero to make it better. And what is happening is that you have a Democrat in the White House. Were it a Republican in the White House, we would have a whole bunch of Democrats that were there with us saying, stop sending these weapons overseas, we need that money here at home. So it's for them, it's about power, it's about staying in power, it's about their positions in power, it's this two-party game. And now it just happens to be a Democrat who's in the White House. So, you know, it will open up. As I said, I think after November, a number of the people in the Progressive Caucus will feel a little freer to criticize a Democrat. And then, you know, it's really kind of like mind-boggling. Who is a progressive? What does it mean? Who is anti-war? What does left and right mean anymore? It's a weird, weird time. And I have a hard time wrapping my brain around it to know who are our allies in all of this, because I'll hear somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, and I said, oh, I just love what she says. I'm so glad she's saying it. And then I hear what she says about women's choice and LGBTQ issues and immigrants and others. And I'm like, oh gosh, you know, is that our ally? It doesn't make sense. So as we go along, things will fall more into place. And whenever these wars break out, there's always a weird beginning on who's against it, how are those people characterized. You're always seen as anti-American, anti-patriotic if you're against whoever in the White House is calling for what war. But then as time goes on, people start realizing that these wars are not in our interest, and we start getting more people on our side, and we'll start getting more of the politicians when they, you know, put up their finger and see which way the wind is blowing.
Thank you. I'll be brief here. My name is Michael. To that point, I'm one of the libertarians who has drifted over here. I feel a lot more at home here. So I just wanted to go back to what you were saying. You know, how do you see the strategy of, you know, allying with libertarians who were disenfranchised, obviously, by the rise of the Bush imperialism, and have come out of that and are very much against war? That's my first question. Is, you know, how does that playing field look like to align with libertarians or folks on the right? The second question is, we're approaching a very difficult economic period with the inflation and the rising interest rates. The interest, I think the yield on the 10-year T-notes around 4%, and it's going to be climbing higher. We now have over $30 trillion in debt. And so if we're starting to see, you know, over $1 billion or more just in servicing our debt, and that's taking up a huge chunk of our federal income, how does that factor into all sorts of things? Because I think that, as bad as it is, could actually play out to be a good thing for us. And I'd like to hear.
In what way do you want to just say?
Well, I think it could be a good thing in that it's going to light a fire under everyone's asses, basically.
Yeah, on the libertarian side, can we see a show of hands? Anybody who considers themselves libertarian?
All right, got one.
Well, we're glad you're here. I think people are very confused about where libertarians stand on a lot of issues. A friend of mine who's a libertarian said, we want the right to our guns so we can defend our pot farms. So libertarians are with some of us half the time and not the other half, who knows. I think, for example, you might recall Congressman Ron Paul, the father of the Senator Rand Paul, and Ron Paul has this institute that brings together a lot of libertarians, just like the Cato Institute. I don't know what libertarian group that you might be more affiliated with. They have a great position on this issue. And I just wrote to them and said, how can we join forces on this issue? And I think we have to do that. In terms of the inflation, I think it's going to get worse. I think there's going to be a global recession. I think it's not going to be good for us. I think it's going to be really bad for working people around the world. And I think that it will force the Western powers to solve this Ukraine war because of the inflationary aspects of this war. But I think it's gonna mean we're in a period of global upheaval. And it's economic upheaval and it's geopolitical upheaval, and the people in this country that think that war is good for the economy or good for US hegemony have been wanting to focus on China and China as our economic adversary. And they are so worried about China overtaking the US economically. And certainly China is overtaking the US economically for good reason. And that is, they don't spend all their money on weapons.
Hello.
That is because they're investing in high-speed rail and have thousands of miles of them. We don't have any of it. It's because they go around the world in their Belt and Road Initiative and they actually build things in other countries. And so, of course, China is overtaking the United States. And I think it's going to get more and more so as the US gets more bogged down in Russia. If we can turn this around, if we can get out of this war in Ukraine, if we can go back to what our friend just told us about manufacturing, how we need to manufacture things in this country that the people in this country actually need, that's a way to rebuild an economy that has some kind of grounding in both good jobs, good paying jobs, and ones that really reflect the real needs of the people instead of just a service economy that we become with a war-making machine. That is the manufacturing side of it. So I'll end by addressing your issue of how do you maintain some kind of positive view as we move forward. And I think that is because we do represent the global majority. I mentioned it when we looked at the speeches at the UN, but it's not just the speeches in the UN by presidents who represent big countries. It's people around the world. And there are places around the world, like in Latin America, like in Cuba, where they just had an incredible example of what local democracy can actually look like when they had a family code that was discussed in every community around the country, and people got to say yes to probably the most progressive family code in the world right now, where it's not only things like you can marry whoever you want to marry, but the rights of children, the rights of grandparents, and access to those children. I mean, incredible things. And you look all over Latin America and you see just amazing things happening. And it doesn't have to just be Latin America. It really is in many places around the world, including in our own backyards. And people who talk about the right next door taking over the piece of land there and turning it into a beautiful community garden. That's part of the peace economy that we are building as we're trying to destroy the war economy that is hurting us and the planet. So let's just keep moving forward, building that peace economy, and recognize that we are part of the majority of the world who want to live in a more peaceful, just, and sustainable world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Medea Bejamin, CODEPINK, will be speaking again tomorrow night in Ann Arbor. I'll just let you know what's going on now. So we're going to start a little march down Livernois, and then we're going to come back in here for a little rally, anti-imperialist rally, whatever you want to say kind of rally, and you can speak from the stage, and there'll be some food left, I hope, and then we'll go on from there.